When I was 24 years old, I saw the UFC on a pay-per-view on TV, and I was so overwhelmed by the athleticism, the skill. And then at the end of the fight, the combatants hugged, they shook hands, and I just fell in love with it.
Part of UFC's appeal is it doesn't look like a balletic display of martial talent and mastery as much as it looks like a bar fight.
We choose to do this because we love the sport, but it is a business. And if you do not treat it like a business, I guarantee you that the promoter is, and you will be left broken at the end of your career.
Each of us have an individual story, but as with anything, you take enough of these individual stories and you see not only crossover, but intersectionality.
A group of former UFC fighters that are suing the UFC scored a key legal victory on Thursday when a federal judge said he would grant their lawsuit class action status.
There have been fights in every major U.S. sport about workers' power in the labor market.
I don't think there's a guy in the sport, from the guy who just got his first fight all the way up to the Conor McGregors, that is pleased with the way the UFC treats fighters. The way we've been strong-armed, the way we've been coerced.
Fights over unionization in some sports, fights over free agency in baseball, and in boxing, the Muhammad Ali Act, which restricts the kinds of contract terms that can be imposed on boxers. The fighters who brought this lawsuit see it as the continuation of a tradition in sports, of athletes fighting to have agency and power in the terms of their work and who they do it for. Mixed martial arts used to be pretty culturally and legally fringe in the United States. It was banned by most states. John McCain had famously called it human cockfighting. There are some rules in the UFC, but to a large extent, all sorts of body parts and tactics and attacks are on the table, and people get seriously injured at times.
My nose has been broken multiple times.
I had my right pectoral torn off, had to get that reattached.
I've had my jaw broken in 2 places. I've had my neck broken.
Had my left ankle broken, had to get that repaired.
I've had torn right labrum in my shoulder.
He broke my eyeball, the bone that holds up my eyeball.
I've had my left eye orbital fracture twice where my eye caved in.
I was swallowing my own blood and I knew, don't blow your nose or both eyes will blow.
At the time that UFC was bought for just $2 million by the former boxing coach, Dana White, and a casino owner he'd been friends with, Lorenzo Fertitta, and his brother Frank Fertitta, UFC was struggling, as were other mixed martial arts promoters. It was pretty much a fixer-upper. The money that they spent to actually purchase it for $2 million was much less than the money they quickly had to sink into it in order to revitalize it. They pulled off a multi-pronged strategy that was quite successful. First, they did what White has referred to as running towards regulation. They found ways to make compromises with state regulators so that the sport would not be illegal. And at the same time, they also popularized it. They made gambles like paying the production costs themselves for the first season of a reality TV show, The Ultimate Fighter, on Spike TV.
It's all over! It is all over! Diego Sanchez is the Ultimate Fighter!
UFC under Dana White had a gift for weaving compelling personal narratives and rivalry. People throwing shoes, a guy coming to the octagon with Who Let the Dogs Out playing while he was dragging another guy on a leash.
My first contract with the UFC is kind of an interesting story because here I am on this reality show, The Ultimate Fighter, and they started to realize how big of a stepping stone this was going to be for the UFC. Sat us all down individually, put a contract in front of us and said, hey, we realize that this is going to be huge and we really want to have you all a part of the UFC family moving forward. So we want to go ahead and get this out of the way, just sign this simple contract and we'll be able to move forward as one unit. But as I'm looking at this thick contract and wondering what I should do, Dana White looks at me and says, don't worry, if this thing takes off, we'll take care of you.
The fighters would say, at the heart of UFC's power is the contracts that it signs with fighters.
Before boxing had competition, boxing used to be dominated by a few dominant promoters, and the contracts were ported over from boxing. And the contracts are basically designed to control every aspect of a fighter's career. They're long-term. They last multiple fights.
Fighters under these contracts are bound to fight only for UFC for a period of time, and UFC can extend that time if a fighter declines a match or if a fighter gets injured.
They control who the fighter fights, they control when the fighter fights, and then they have a number of different clauses that make it very difficult for a fighter to ever break free from the UFC if that fighter ever did want to become a free agent.
Contracts are so one-sided. There really is no negotiation room for any of the things, especially as you're coming up and as their stranglehold on the sport of MMA got so much stronger.
Part of what's at the heart of this lawsuit is the ways that UFC successfully took other competitors off the board.
The UFC had such a stranglehold on mixed martial arts, and as they were buying up so much of the competition, shutting them all down, they really became the only option for anybody that wanted to do this professionally.
If you follow Dana White's Twitter or watch him on YouTube, you could have seen Dana White calling himself the Grim Reaper and bragging about how he has defeated or derailed or acquired one after another company that tried to compete with the UFC. In 2011, UFC acquired Strikeforce, which at the time was the most prominent rival still standing.
Kung Lee is unbelievable. It was a great fight. Let's hear it for him one more time. Scott Smith and Kung Lee.
The CEO of Strikeforce, Scott Coker, has said in the past that he saw himself like Luke Skywalker up against the Death Star trying to compete with UFC.
Eventually, when Strikeforce was bought out by UFC, my only option was go to UFC because they had the rest of my contract. Now I'm under a contract where it's only an 18-month contract with 6 fights, but 5 years later, I'm still stuck in the contract.
Dana White, president.
The month before UFC's parent company, Zuffa, completed its acquisition of Strikeforce, a UFC executive sent an email, and the subject line of that email was, "We own MMA."
And the UFC has admitted in documents that have now become public that they've almost never lost a fighter that they wanted to keep.
In internal UFC emails, we now know the company referred to what it was doing as choking off oxygen to the competition. The most important oxygen that UFC allegedly ran afoul of the law by cutting off to its competitors is the fighters themselves.
And not only did they make it clear to us, they made it clear to the whole mixed martial arts world, there is no negotiating.
These are very strict, never-ending contracts, and that's the case to this day. The UFC just says, oh, you want to fight for us, you sign here. If you don't want to, we've got 20 other guys that'll take your spot.
They have 70, 80, 90% of the top fighters under exclusive contract, meaning that those fighters are not available to any other MMA promoter.
And fighters, even if they wiggled their way out of the very restrictive contracts that UFC imposed on them, didn't have another professional mixed martial arts option because there weren't robust rivals to go sell their work to.
On Tuesday afternoon, a class action lawsuit was filed in U.S. District Court in San Jose against Zuffa LLC with fighters Kung Lee, Nate Quarry, and John Fitch attached to the suit.
Rampage Jackson came to me and says, "Hey, Kung, I know this lawyer. He will help get some fairness for the fighters, in the marketplace." And I decided I wanted to step up for all the fighters that's being affected.
At the end of 2014, more than 6 years ago now, a group of now all former fighters filed an antitrust class action lawsuit against UFC.
And in broad terms, the case is an antitrust case where we're claiming that the UFC is both a monopoly and a monopsony.
Usually when we talk about monopoly, we're talking about the power that a company has when it becomes the only one selling something. Monopsony is about the power of being a monopoly purchaser of something, and particularly a monopoly purchaser of labor. A key argument in this lawsuit has been about, as UFC succeeds and its revenue soars, how much should we expect that, absent illegal conduct, the fighters' pay would soar as well. In UFC, year after year, the share of the company's revenue that goes to actually paying the workers doing the fighting has hovered around or below 20%.
And what this analysis shows through complex statistical regression modeling is that if the UFC was competitive and did not allegedly violate the antitrust laws, it would pay its fighters 50% or more of the revenues it's generated, just like baseball, just like hockey, just like basketball, boxing. If instead of paying 20% of the revenues generated, it paid 50% or more of the revenues generated, the fighters would have made $1.6 billion more during the period that we measured, 2010 to 2017.
Sometimes when you write about allegations against companies, and particularly about lawsuits against companies, those companies don't want to say a whole lot about them or are pretty dismissive of the significance of litigation against them. UFC, in their comments to me, has been pretty feisty about this, saying that they see this lawsuit actually as a threat to the ability of businesses to take risks and succeed, and that they don't want to roll over, that they want to fight it and they want to defeat it. The fighters I talked to described having side jobs, being reliant on UFC in part because after taxes and expenses, they weren't making enough money to feel financially secure.
The overview of my career from a financial perspective is, something I've had a challenge in admitting. I can tell you now that I lived in my mom's detached garage the entire time I was fighting, and I had a second job as a bouncer and a bartender, a third job as a personal trainer, just to make ends meet.
Nate Quarry told me that over his time in UFC, he fought fights while he was tens of thousands of dollars in debt coming into the fight.
It gets so disheartening because I've seen fights that are called the fight of the year. This is just this brutal war, and they battled for 4.5 rounds until one guy's body just gave up. And then you find out, oh, that guy made $60,000 for that fight.
In one of the hearings in this lawsuit, UFC's attorney argued that if the fighters were really the product, if all that UFC were selling were the fighters, then the fighters wouldn't need UFC at all. That a fighter is not themselves the UFC product any more than an Apple engineer who makes a cool iPhone is the product that Apple is selling.
We, the fighters, make this whole thing happen. And it's been driven by Chuck Liddell. It's been driven by Randy Couture. It's been driven by Conor McGregor. It's been driven by Brock Lesnar. It's been driven by all the greats that have walked before us and that walk this path right now. We are the product.
If the fighters are not the product, then go ahead and release us from our contracts. You'll do fine without us, clearly.
It's the identity and rank and popularity of those fighters that attract the eyeballs and make the sport what it is. And if you can lock all those up and keep them from other promotions, you can dominate the sport, which is what they've admitted they've done.
William Isaacson, a lawyer for UFC, said in a statement that UFC has spent many years building a world-class organization, enhancing the brand of our athletes, and championing the sport of MMA. UFC pays its fighters more than any other MMA promoter, with average fighter compensation rising by over 600% since 2005. Our efforts have raised the global popularity of the sport and the overall revenue potential of all MMA organizations and athletes. In December of 2020, the judge announced a crucial step in this lawsuit, which is that he is going to certify it as a class action. Class certification makes this lawsuit a much more significant threat to UFC, and the judge made clear long before saying how he planned to rule that he expected whatever he did to be appealed into federal appeals court and on from there to the US Supreme Court. So we are likely in for many more months and years of wrangling over this. Kyle Kingsbury said that he doesn't think any settlement would be acceptable unless it includes a change to the restrictive contracts that UFC uses to keep fighters bound to the UFC.
My son's about to turn 6 years old, and it started when he was in the womb. You know, we're in this thing to the end to change the sport forever. We want the same freedoms that are offered in any other major sport, and every other major sport has gone through what we're going through right now.
People tell fighters, just shut up. Look at how lucky you are. Well, no, actually, we're fighting for what we believe in. We're going to continue being fighters, and that's how we're made.